Hi, this is Ian Crane from Event One Software, and today I'm going to show you how you can use Sage Timberline Office Connector to create some of your own Excel-based reports. The series of 5 examples I'm showing are all documented online on our Getting Started page. If you want to try this yourself by following step-by-step instructions, then click the blue Help icon on Office Connector's toolbar. You can get there by clicking on Add-ins and the blue icon. This takes you to our Getting Started page, and you can see our the quick tour along with the other 4 exercises listed here. And today we're going to do the lost check report. Here are the directions. This is kind of what you can expect to see, some screenshots for reassurance along with the step-by-step directions. Okay, so let's get started. As is my habit, I'm going to start by labeling the sheet. Something relevant about what we're doing, lost checks. Alright, and I want to insert a list of bank accounts. That'll be my first step, so I'll click in A3 here, and I'm going to click on the Query Wizard toolbar button. It's going to prompt me for my data folder, and I am picking the Timberline construction sample data, and you should do the same since this exercise was designed for it. So Office Connector presents me with a list of tables, and I want to select the bank account table, which is in cash management. I'm going to use Control F to jump right down there and type bank account. I'm just going to start the word account, and it matches and jumps right straight to it. That Control F thing is a handy tool for finding fields and tables. Alright, I've got my table. I'm going to click Next, and I want to see the bank account and the description. And I don't need any filtering, I just want to see the entire list, so I'm going to click Finish. Awesome. Next thing I want to do is create an input cell for my dates. I want to be able to see checks that are older than a certain cutoff period so that they're the ones that are concerning if they're lost, right? If they're not clearing the bank, then they could be lost. More recent checks, we kind of expect that. So I'm going to label this checks on or before, and I'm going to enter in a date that's appropriate for my sample data. Now your version of Sage Timberline Office may have different dates in the sample data. It just depends on the version, and we cover that in the tutorial. In the step here where you're entering the date, you can click on a link here to show a list that shows the year to use depending on your version of Sage Timberline Office. I'm on 9.8, so I'm using 2011, which you can see here. And since I'm using this as an input field, I want to name it. It makes my formulas look more readable. It makes it show up in the wizard, which you'll see here in a minute. So I'm going to name it cutoff date. Okay, just type it in there and hit enter. Cool. Now I want to add a column that uses this date. What I want to get is a count of checks for each bank account that are unreconciled as of that date. So let's label the column potentially lost checks. Apply some bold formatting there just to keep it all looking the same. Alright, and then in cell C4 I'm going to insert my count function. And I'm going to do that by clicking on the Count Wizard button on the toolbar. You can see it's got a 1, 2, 3 by it as it counts away. And the bank account table I used last, but I need to look at the transactions. So I'm going to just scroll down this time. I'm already close to it. Transaction is right there. Select my table and click Next. And now I need some conditions. So I'm going to click Add Condition. And the first thing I want is the bank account being appropriate for the row that I'm in. And right now I'm in row 4, you can see over here, and the bank account's in column A. So I'm going to use a cell reference to A4. And I'm going to use $A4 so that the column A never changes, but the 4 does. The 4 will go to 5 and 6 and so forth as the number of banks increases, 1 for each row. Click OK. I'm going to add another condition now. Since I'm looking at the transaction table, there's more than just checks in there. I want to make sure I'm only looking at checks. So look at the transaction type. And I don't need a cell reference for this. It's only ever going to be about checks. So I'm going to make it a literal value. And then I'll just pick check from my list. And click OK. And then I also want to make sure that I'm only looking at unreconciled checks. So I'm going to type REC to jump down to reconciliation status. And I'm going to pick it to be equal to a literal value. Again, I would never use this report for reconciled checks. I'm going to pick O. The capital O is for unreconciled. And then finally, I want to use my cutoff date. And I'm going to add a condition for that. And that'll be based on the reference date. And I want it to be less than or equal, because it's a cutoff date. Don't want to accidentally make it be equal, because then you'll have no records probably unless you just happen to match that date. I want everything before or equal to the date. And I want to use my cell reference that I created. And since I did create a named range, it shows up in this drop list. I don't have to type in a cell value. I can pick cutoff date. And I'll hit OK. And I've got my conditions done, so I'll click Finish to insert the formula. And you can see here it's coming back with 22 for that. And I'm going to double click the file handle to fill down the formula to the other rows. Other row in this case, but you'll probably have more or could have more in your data. So now that I've got a count of the old checks, this is summary information. I want to get some details. I want to see exactly what those 22 checks are. Since each of these is based on a particular bank, I'm going to make an input cell here for a specific bank. And I'm going to call this bank account ID. That's my label. In the input field, I'll give it a bank account, and you can look at the values in column A here. These are what you want to match on. So I'm going to type first. Okay. And let's make this bold just because it's a label. And then the input cell, we want to name it, right? Just like before. We're going to name this one, and we're going to name it bank account ID. I can't use spaces, so I'm just running it all together with capitals. And now I've got a named input for that. Now I want to see a row for each of these 22 checks. So I'm going to click in A10 here, where I want my query to show up. I'm going to use a query for this. So I click on the Query Wizard toolbar button. And since I was already working with the transaction table, it's already selected. And I'll just click Next. And now I'm going to pick the columns I want to see. All right, I want bank account, description, accounting date, reference date, subtraction, and I also want the check. Let's say CH, there it is, check and payee. And I'll click Next. And now I need these conditions to basically match what we had before so that they jive. So we got 22 in account, we want to see 22 rows. The only real difference is going to be that instead of one for each row, they're all going to be for a given bank. And so my first condition will be equal to that input field I made for bank ID, bank account ID. So all the rows returned in this query are going to be for that bank. I'll add another condition for type. Just like before, it's just a fixed type of check. Don't need to see deposits. And another condition for the reconciliation status, REC, there we go. Reconciliation status equal to O for unreconciled. I'll click OK. And finally, we need to use the cutoff date. So I'm going to add that in there and pick the reference date less than or equal, and switch back to using a parameter. Now you saw before we had cell reference. This says parameter. A parameter is just a cell reference for queries. We're using the same names that Excel uses, and you'll actually see that here in a minute when we change the way the parameters act. So using the name parameters is consistent and should be helpful. So go ahead and click cutoff date, and we'll use that as our cutoff date. Perfect. Now we're ready to insert the query. I'm just going to click Finish. And we should have about 22 rows. I'm starting in row 10. Check this out. If you hit Control End, it jumps you down to the bottom row being used. Kind of handy. So 32 rows, starting at row 10, 22. Yeah, it jives. Looks like I got the right data. I'm happy. Let's give this thing a whirl. I'm going to type in first PR dash PR, exactly like I see in my column A here. I'm going to match a value. and then I'll hit refresh. Let's go to our add-ins tab and hit refresh, and I should see 367. We'll use that control end to jump down. Yep, 377 minus starting at row 10, 367. Looking good, looking good. All right. Now, this is kind of cool. We got an interactive tool, but there is a little bit of a nuance to it that we want to address. So these are workbook functions, and they automatically update whenever their input cell changes. But this query is not doing the same thing. So that could get strange if I change this date. Let's say I go back in time a little bit on 4/15. Then I would expect to have fewer results showing up. And sure enough, there should be only 9 coming out of the first bank. So let's try this first. And now refresh. Go back to 4:30. Alright, so now there should be 22, and we're still seeing only just the 9. And I can refresh, and they'll show up. Alright, so what we want to do is change the parameters of this to behave the same way that these workbook functions are. In a lot of cases, you don't want to do this because you'll have a bunch of dates, and every time you change one of the parameters, your query will refresh again and again. So a lot of times we, on purpose, will not make them behave this way, so it's why the default doesn't do it. But in this case, these fields are pretty isolated. The data is not huge. This is a good place to use this interactivity. So click anywhere inside of the query area, and then go to the parameters menu. This is why we call them parameters instead of cell references. So I click on there, and I can say I have 2 parameters to my query. One is the bank account ID, and I'm going to check this box down here that says refresh automatically when the cell value changes. I'm going to do that for cutoff date as well. Now if I type 4:15, it jumps to 9, and this jumps to 9 immediately. And if I type first -PR, it should jump right to 299. Awesome. Let's try something a little farther out. How about on 5:30? We have 31 here, and let's change this to first. Look at that. So it's pretty cool. It just instantly reacts. So when you first open the workbook, it'll do a full refresh, and then as you play with the input values, the numbers will change automatically. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson, got something good out of it. I know I've definitely enjoyed showing you some of the great features of Excel and Office Connector.